Thomas Ellery wasn't the kind of man who picked fights. He was quiet, methodical, a mechanical engineer by trade, a woodworker on weekends. After his father passed away, Thomas left Austin behind and moved to Cypress Ridge to live on the land that had raised 3 generations of Ellerys. The property sat at the very edge of Crystal Bay, a quiet lake known more for fishing and paddleboarding than anything flashy. His dad always told him, "The lake gives what you give to it." Thomas took that to heart. He trimmed back the trees carefully, kept the natural slope untouched, and built a modest frame cabin set 50 feet from the waterline. No fences, no concrete. Just peace. Until one morning, that peace was shattered. It started with the buzz of a drone. Not his. This one flew low to low, hovering above the dock like a vulture. When Thomas stepped outside to shoo it away, he saw a woman in heels and a pantsuit across the cove, pointing and nodding as if she were laying claim. That was Karen HOA, president for the greater Cypress Ridge community, and that drone. Hers. Later that week, a certified letter arrived, a formal notice from the HOA stating that due to municipal zoning adjustments and infrastructure annexation, Thomas's property was now under the jurisdiction of the Cypress Ridge Homeowners Association. He reread it 3 times, heart pounding. His property was never part of the HOA. His father had bought it decades before the neighborhood even existed, yet here they were telling him it was theirs now, and worse, there was a note attached. Hand signed by Karen herself. Karen, Mr. Ellery, we're excited to bring your section into our growing community. Attached are new compliance guidelines and development plans for shared amenities. Your contribution ensures progress. Warmly, Karen HOA, president. See our HOA contribution. Compliance. Thomas stared out at the lake and felt something tighten in his chest. The next day, he marched into the HOA's Lake Community Center. Stone columns, glass for Wade, manicured roses. Inside, the meeting room buzzed with chatter, mostly retirees discussing lawn height and mailbox paint. Karen sat at the front, her platinum blonde bob as rigid as her expression. Thomas stood in the back until she finally glanced up. Karen, Mr. Ellery, you're outside our normal attendance. Thomas, I'm not under your HOA. You don't get to zone me in like this. Karen, the county disagrees. You can file a formal objection if you have legal representation. In the meantime, Shoreline Heights moves forward. Thomas, what's Shoreline Heights? Karen flipped open a binder. Inside were glossy rendering slick condos with rooftop patios and private lake access stacked 5 high along his slope. Karen, it's a luxury housing initiative. We're modernizing the lakefront. Phase 1 begins in 30 days. He stared at the blueprints in disbelief. They had already drawn roads, parking, a clubhouse, on land they didn't own. Thomas walked out of the meeting room with a tight jaw and a fast pulse. On the drive home, he pulled over twice just to calm his breathing. That night, he sat at his father's old desk and opened the dusty file cabinet. Original land deeds, a surveyor's map from 1971. Even a notarized exemption letter from the original county commissioner stating that the Ellery parcel would remain sovereign from community overlays. It was ironclad. But power doesn't always respect paper, especially when someone like Karen smells money. And she wasn't finished. The following week, flags went up. Orange stakes with pink ribbon lining the woods beside Thomas's home. An HOA planning committee member waved as he passed. Thomas didn't wave back. He pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and began documenting everything. Thomas had inherited more than land. He'd inherited a fight. And across the lake, Karen wasn't backing down. Neither of them knew it yet, but the war for Crystal Bay was just beginning, and nature was quietly keeping score. Thomas Ellery knew something most of the new residents didn't. That lake didn't just reflect the trees, it reflected history. His grandfather used to fish in it before the roads were paved. His father carved their initials into a stone near the shoreline the year Thomas was born. This wasn't just property, it was roots. But to Karen Holland and the HOA board, it was underutilized space, and they were ready to transform it whether he agreed or not. Thomas stood at the county courthouse 3 days later, binder under his arm, jaw tight. He filed a formal dispute against the HOA's zoning claim. The clerk barely glanced at the papers before saying the words he feared. Clerk, sir, it's going to take at least 60 days to process. That's if it doesn't get kicked back. Thomas, but I have original plats, exemption status, and a non-annexation clause from 1971. Clerk, might help. But until this is resolved, the HOA can proceed under assumed jurisdiction. Assumed jurisdiction. He walked out of the courthouse with a gut full of gravel and a growing suspicion this wasn't just bureaucracy. Someone had greased the gears. That evening, he attended another HOA board meeting, this time with backup. His cousin Meyer, a local attorney, came with him. Meyer, they're hoping you don't know how to fight this. Most people fold. But you've got documentation. That's leverage. Karen stood as the meeting began, the room filled with polite neighbors and sugary drinks. But her smile hardened when she saw Meyer seated beside Thomas. Karen, we welcome community input, especially from new members. Mr. Ellery, would you like to share something? Thomas stood slowly, pulling out the oldest map he had, a county survey with a faint pencil sketch outlining the original Ellery boundary. He laid it on the table. Thomas, this land was never part of the HOA. You can't zone your way through history. Karen, Mr. Ellery, no one is taking anything from you. We're offering progress, community growth, property value. Maya leaned forward, voice calm but sharp. Meyer, Mum, did you file a public notice when attempting to annex the land? Karen faltered. Just slightly. Karen, we notified the planning department. Our legal team handled the filings. Maya, then, you won't mind producing those documents? In court, the room shifted. As turned, whispers started. Karen, this isn't the place for legal threats. Thomas, neither is my shoreline. The next morning, the first set of trees came down anyway. Thomas woke to the grind of a chainsaw and saw workers in hard hats clearing brush on the north side of his land. No permits posted. No markers, just orange tape and the roar of diesel engines. He sprinted down the slope, waving his arms. Thomas, you're trespassing. Shut that down. The foreman raised his clipboard. Foreman, HOA gave us clearance. We're prepping the foundation grid. Phase 1. Thomas, you're on private land. That's illegal. Foreman, take it up with the board. We're just following orders. Thomas took photos, license plates, machinery, GPS coordinates. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He documented. That night, his motion sensor lights blinked out. The next morning, his water hose was slashed. The HOA said nothing, but Karen walked past with her golden retriever and a glass of wine, never looking at him. Thomas turned his focus to the community. He printed flyers, held a meeting in his driveway, showed neighbors the history, the documents, the proof. Some of them nodded, some avoided eye contact. One couple quietly whispered to him that they supported him, but they had a kid at the HOA-run preschool and didn't want trouble. Karen had more than legal control. She had fear, and she wasn't done. A week later, Thomas received a notice, unapproved, structure violation, remove non-compliant dock immediately. It wasn't even part of the HOA. But the harassment had begun. They thought they could break him with citations and silence, but they underestimated one thing. The lake didn't belong to them, and neither did its memory. Thomas wasn't just fighting for property anymore, he was fighting for something deeper. And he was about to expose just how far Karen would go to bury the truth beneath concrete and lies. Thomas Ellery woke up to the tremble of the earth. Not a quake, but the deep, guttural vibration of machines. He rushed to the window, down the hill. On the lakeside slope that used to be forest and brush, set to massive bulldozers, a third machine, a concrete mixer, was parked crookedly at the edge of the WATERLINE. They had begun. No permits posted. No warning. Just engines roaring and dust swirling like a storm on the rise. He was down the slope in a minute, flannel shirt half buttoned, boots and tied. Thomas shouting over the machines. Cut the engines. You're trespassing on private property. A foreman in a vest turned. UNBOTHERED. Foreman. We've got clearance. HOA owns this zone. Site prep starts today. Thomas. That's my land. And I've filed a dispute with the county. It's under legal review. The foreman didn't argue. He stepped away and made a call. Moments later, a black SUV pulled up clean. Shiny HOA plates on the dash. Karen HOA stepped out, perfectly composed in a navy pantsuit and heels. Like she was arriving at a brunch, not a land grab. Karen, with a smile, loud enough for the workers to hear. Mr. Ellery, we appreciate your concern. But everything is in order. You've had ample opportunity to comply. Thomas, I never joined your HOA. I never agreed to this. Karen, this is community development. Thomas, you're choosing to isolate yourself when you could be part of progress. These homes bring value to everyone, including you. Thomas, you bulldozed a shoreline that's protected by county watershed rules. You poured concrete without drainage plans. Karen, our engineers handled it. Thomas pulled out his phone and started filming. Thomas, say that again. On camera, Karen's eyes narrowed. Karen, this is harassment. Thomas, this is documentation. By the end of the day, they had torn down 6 trees, flattened to terraces, and dumped the first load of gravel for a foundation. The land that once soaked up rainwater was now exposed, dirt, brittle, and unstable. Thomas returned to his cabin and did what he always did when he needed clarity. He sat at his father's desk and started writing. His time, it wasn't a journal entry. It was a complaint filed to the county environmental office. Filed to the building inspector. Filed to the local news. He attached photos, drone footage, historical plats, and a copy of the exemption letter that clearly outlined his property's independence from the HOA. But no response came that week. Instead, on Friday afternoon, he found a warning taped to his front door. Final notice. Remove a legal dock and non-compliant shed within 72 hours, or face fines. Thomas laughed out loud. Bitter. Disbelieving. He'd never needed HOA approval. Never been under their domain. Yet here they were issuing fines like a government. And then the shed door blew open in the wind, and he noticed the lock had been snapped. Someone had broken in. Nothing was taken. But the message was clear. You're not untouchable. Thomas installed cameras the next morning. Every angle. He posted new signage. Clear and legal. Private property. Trespassers will be reported. And then he waited. But the next confrontation didn't come from a chainsaw. It came from the neighbors. That Sunday, a group of residents walked up his drive for couples, 3 of whom Thomas had only waved at before. They weren't angry, just conflicted, nervous. One of them, a man in his 50s with a tucked-in polo and hesitant eyes, spoke first. Man, look, Thomas, Karen told us you were holding up the development. Said you were suing the HOA, that it's hurting all our property values. Thomas, you really think I'd sabotage my own land for spite? Woman beside him, she said you didn't own it legally. Thomas walked them into the cabin, opened the old filing cabinet, and laid out every document across the table: title deeds, tax records, the exemption letter with the county seal. They stared in silence. Thomas, she lied to you. She's gambling with your money. And with this lake, the woman glanced at the window, toward the newly poured slabs along the shore. Women, there's no drainage slope left. What happens when it rains hard? Thomas, that's what I've been trying to tell her. That night, clouds rolled in, heavy, slow-moving. Rain pelted the lake for 12 straight hours. Thomas stood at the window as the water level rose by inches, then feet. By dawn, half of the construction site was a muddy pit, water pooled in places it never had before, and a set of fresh foundation pillars set surrounded by standing water. But Karen, she still wasn't worried, because she believed concrete always won. She forgot that nature doesn't play by HOA rules. The rain didn't stop, not after the first storm, or the second, for 3 straight weeks. Low-pressure systems drag across the region, pounding Crystal Bay with sheets of rain that felt biblical. And with every downpour, the lake crept a little higher. What used to be a shoreline of reeds and native brush had been stripped to nothing. Karen's pet project Shoreline Heights was now a muddy construction zone pressed tight against a swelling body of water with nowhere left to drain. Thomas stood at the edge of his cabin deck each morning, watching nature reclaim what Karen had tried to tame. He could already see signs of failure. Water pooled behind the concrete barriers. Foundation slabs had cracks from soil shifting beneath them, and to massive runoff trenches, which were supposed to lead water away from the site, were nothing but decorative ditches. And yet construction continued. Concrete trucks came like clockwork. Workers hauled in beams and siding. Framing began. For the first 5 units, it was as if Karen believed the lake would eventually surrender. Then came the community meeting. Karen called it an informational gathering at the HOA clubhouse, her chance to reassure residents and dispel rumors. Thomas didn't attend, but he didn't need to. Meyer went in his place armed with photos, rainfall data, and an email thread from a civil engineer that warned about shoreline destabilization. Inside, Karen smiled for the room, all charm and gloss. Karen, yes, the lake is elevated. Yes, we're aware of the moisture concerns, but this is all accounted for. We've consulted professionals every step of the way. Then Meyer stood up from the back row. Meyer, could you name the engineering firm responsible for drainage? Karen faltered. Karen, well, it was the contracted firm through the developer, not the HOA directly. Meyer, because I contacted every firm in the county. None of them claim involvement. And the site logs list no inspections since construction began. The room went quiet. Just the hum of the overhead lights and the nervous shuffle of papers. Karen, ma'am, you're not a resident. You don't have the floor. Meyer, I'm legal counsel for Miss Strellery, and I've filed an environmental hazard complaint on his behalf as of this morning. Karen's jaw clenched, but she didn't respond. She didn't have to. The room had already shifted. By week 4, the problems could no longer be ignored. Unit 3's foundation cracked clean through, splitting the slab and forcing a pause in framing. A construction foreman quit on the spot after rain-soaked insulation, and black mold appeared in stacked drywall. And then the county arrived. 2 inspectors, one with a clipboard, the other with a drone. They asked questions no one wanted to answer. When they requested Karen's copy of the drainage plans, she claimed they were filed digitally. But the inspectors didn't look convinced. Thomas watched from his porch as the drone buzzed over the site. His phone vibrated with a message from Meyer. They've flagged the stormwater retention issue. More to come. That night, Thomas walked the shoreline by flashlight. The lake was quiet, rippling under the dark sky. He stopped near one of the condo pads barely 30 feet from where the natural slope used to break runoff. He knelt beside the water's edge and dug his fingers into the saturated soil. It crumbled like wet cake. He looked up and whispered to himself, "This ground's going to give." The next morning, Karen was back. SUV parked sideways, lips pressed tight, heels sinking into mud as she yelled at workers to stay on schedule. Her voice carried across the lot. Karen, I don't care about some overcautious inspector. We keep building, period. If they issue a warning, we'll appeal it. Someone asked about the water line. Karen's response was flat. It's just weather. But it wasn't just weather. It was the lake rising with purpose. And every condo they built brought the water closer to disaster. Karen was still playing queen, but her castle was built on soaked earth and buried warnings. And very soon the lake would remind them all who ruled this shoreline. When people feel power slipping through their fingers, they grasp tighter even if it means dragging others down with them. That's exactly what Karen Holland did next. The lake was rising. County inspectors were circling the ground beneath. The condos had turned into a soggy disaster zone. And Thomas, he became her scapegoat. It began with a newsletter, printed on glossy paper with the HOA's logo stamped at the top. It was slipped into every resident's mailbox overnight. Community update. Ellery property causing environmental impact. Karen didn't mention Thomas by name, but everyone knew. The letter accused adjacent landowners of disrupting approved drainage designs, failing to maintain natural runoff flow, and obstructing HOA-mandated improvements for the greater good. Thomas held the paper in his hand and stared at it in silence. The wording was careful, just enough to incite suspicion, just vague enough to dodge a lawsuit. He walked the neighborhood the next day, speaking calmly with anyone who talked to him. Some shut their doors. Others looked over their shoulders before whispering. Neighbor 1, she says you rerouted the slope. Neighbor 2, we just want this whole thing to be over. Man, I've got water pooling in my crawl space. Thomas, because they destroyed the natural drainage buffer. That slope you're blaming. It used to be a wetland shelf. It absorbed runoff. They paved it. But fear had set in. Karen had made it clear. Defend Thomas, and you risk your standing in the HOA. At the next board meeting, Karen called for a closed session, but Thomas showed up anyway. Binder in hand. Karen, this meeting is for board business only. Thomas, I'm part of this now, remember? You forced my land into your jurisdiction. I'm here. He placed photos on the table. Waterline rise, slope erosion, the split concrete of Unit 3's foundation. Then he placed the HOA newsletter beside them. Thomas, this is libel. You blamed me for structural failure caused by your development and the runoff issues. You buried the stormwater retention basin. I warned you 3 months ago. You ignored me. Karen's smile was tight. Karen, we appreciate your concerns, Mr. Ellery. But this isn't personal. It's administrative. Maya stepped forward from the back of the room. Meyer, and the misuse of HOA funds for legal defense against a private citizen. That's not administrative. That's criminal. We've submitted our findings to the State HOA Oversight Board. The room fell silent. Even the board members looked uneasy. But Karen didn't fold. She doubled down. 2 days later, a crew arrived with orange cones and rebar. Their mission: dig a makeshift trench across Thomas's northern boundary, claiming it would improve runoff flow for the new construction. They were halfway through when Thomas came down the hill. Camera rolling. Thomas, you're digging into private land. That's trespassing, crewman. We were told this area's been annexed. Thomas, then tell your boss to meet me here with a signed order. I'll wait. The crew backed off, but not before gouging a deep cut into his sill. By the weekend, the lake was at record level, inches from overtopping its usual banks. Karen called an emergency HOA town hall, this time in the high school auditorium. The room was packed, nervous. Voices, whispers, folding chairs scraping against tile. Karen stood at the podium, voice calm but pointed. Karen, there are always people who resist change. People who cling to the past and block progress. We are not those people. We build forward. But when someone chooses to disrupt that growth, we all suffer. She motioned to a slideshow photos of flooded condos, muddy yards, water pooling near sidewalks. Karen, this is what obstruction looks like. Then she clicked again to a grainy, zoomed-in photo of Thomas standing near the shoreline, flashlight in hand. The implication was clear. Thomas didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because the next image Karen clicked was one she hadn't vetted. It was from the county inspector's report, an aerial drone shot showing water pooling directly over the condo foundations, and no retention trench in sight. Gasps spread through the room. Someone muttered from the back, resident, that's not Thomas. That's just bad engineering. Another voice, resident 2, she built those homes too close to the lake. Karen froze. She tried to shift the narrative back, but the doubt had already taken root. Karen thought her control was absolute, but she underestimated one thing: truth has weight. And the flood was bringing it to the surface. Because soon, the homes would start to break, the county would return, and the silence she built her power on would shatter like the concrete she poured on stolen land. Collapse doesn't always happen in a moment. Sometimes, it starts with a groan in the earth, a crack in silence, a weight too heavy for its own foundation. For Karen Holland and Shoreline Heights, collapse came after the fifth storm. It had rained for 10 hours straight. The lake had swallowed the lower slope. And beneath the new condos under, that expensive concrete and fresh sod the ground had begun to move. Thomas was asleep when the call came in. Meyer, you need to get down to the construction site. Now, Unit 5's basement just buckled. Thomas pulled on his boots and jacket. Heart hammering. Outside, floodlights lit up the hill like a movie set. A sheriff's cruiser blocked part of the access road. And behind it water. Not paddled. Not pulling, moving. He passed through the caution tape and saw it for himself. The slope had given out beneath Unit 5. What was once a firm foundation had collapsed into a single filled with stormwater. Framing lumber leaned sideways, twisted, nails hanging like snapped nerves. Mud had surged into the crawl space and pulled wiring with it. A family of 4 had been scheduled to move in the following week. Karen arrived 20 minutes later. Hair frizzed, heels sinking into the mud. She stormed through the site in disbelief, demanding answers no one could give. Karen, where are the engineers who signed off on this site? A county inspector turned toward her, calm but firm. Inspector, we have a bigger problem. This isn't isolated. There's water beneath every foundation. No compaction testing was logged. And we've pulled the HOA's building permits pending investigation. Karen's face flushed red for the first time. Her voice shook. Karen, this must be sabotage. That Ellery man, he's been interfering since the start. The inspector didn't even flinch. Inspector, Mom, your own documents show these homes were built without proper slope calculations, and someone signed off on them. Thomas stood nearby, silent, his camera rolling. By morning, 3 more units had standing water in their basements. Our emergency funds were tap dry. Insurance agents hovered like vultures, taking notes, shaking their heads. Then came the red tags. Bright orange signs were nailed to front doors. Unsafe structure. Do not occupy. Construction halted. Karen canceled all HOA meetings for the week and went dark. No emails. No calls returned. Residents were left with silence and the smell of wet wood rotting in the July heat. Thomas stayed back, but not inactive. He compiled everything: photos, time-stamped video, email threads, and copies of county warnings. Then he forwarded it to a local reporter at Channel 6 Investigates. A young journalist named Donnie Reyes had been following HOA corruption stories for months. She replied within the hour. Donnie, got it? This runs deep. We're moving fast. That Friday, the story aired. HOA construction scandal. Lakefront collapse in Cypress Ridge. The footage showed the collapsed foundation. Karen arguing with the inspector. Drone shots of standing water across the site. And then, a graphic, key permits missing. HOA bypassed county oversight. Residents gathered on porches to watch. In group chats, in driveways, some were angry, some were stunned, but most were afraid, because now their home values were tied to a sinking shoreline and a scandal with legs. Saturday morning, HOA board member Frank Blanton knocked on Thomas's door. Frank, I want to apologize for everything. Thomas didn't respond. Frank, I didn't know. Karen handled the permits. She said it was all legit. Now the board's panicking. We're calling an emergency vote to remove her. Thomas, you should have asked questions before now. Frank, I know, but I'm asking now, can we fix this? Thomas looked down the slope, where water still lapped against the jagged edge of concrete and mud. Thomas, not until you admit how it started. That evening, a group of residents showed up at Karen's house, not with torches or pitchforks, but with questions, real ones. Why hadn't she disclosed her brother's company was listed on the construction documents? Why were the same signatures used on both the HOA filings and the contractor's site approvals? Karen didn't answer. She slammed the door. But someone had already started talking. The construction foreman, the same one who'd walked off weeks ago, had given a statement to the county, and his testimony would shake everything loose. The Walls weren't just cracking beneath the condos, they were cracking inside the HOA. And the truth, it was seeping in, just like the water rising from the lake bed. Karen built her empire on control, intimidation, and a polished smile. But karma was water, and it doesn't knock. It breaks through. Every lie eventually has a paper trail. And buried within Karen HOA's fortress of authority was a secret she never thought would surface. But when the lake started swallowing her condos, and the cameras turned toward her polished smile, the truth rose like flood water. And Thomas Ellery was about to learn. He hadn't just been fighting an HOA president, he'd been fighting a business partner. It started with a brown envelope, no return address, left on the hood of Thomas's truck. Inside were copies of internal HOA financial documents. Most were redacted, but 2 pages weren't. One was a vendor contract for Phase 1 infrastructure oversight. The other an invoice for $48. $200 billed to the HOA and signed by Frank Holland, Karen's younger brother. His title, Civil Consultant, Ridgepoint Developments. Thomas froze. Ridgepoint? That was the same company name on the trucks delivering concrete to Shoreline Heights. He checked the county contractor filings. There it was, Ridgepoint Developments, licensed under Frank Holland. Karen had quietly rooted the entire project through her brother's firm. That's why there were no public bidding records, no competitive quotes. This wasn't about progress. It was profit, controlled from inside the HOA, disguised as community expansion. Thomas sent the documents to Meyer. She called him 5 minutes later. Meyer, this is fraud, clear-cut self-dealing. She approved contracts to her own family's company. That violates HOA bylaws and state ethics laws. Thomas, she used my land to pad her brother's wallet. Meyer, we're taking this to the That afternoon, Channel 6 Investigates ran a follow-up story. Conflict of interest. HOA president linked to developer behind Shoreline Heights. The news anchor held up to enlarged documents, Karen's signature on the HOA approvals, and Frank's name on the payout invoices. Residents started talking loudly. By evening, the HOA group chat had exploded with screenshots, anger, and resignation calls. Karen didn't come to the next meeting, but Frank did. And for the first time, someone on the board asked the question out loud. Board member, did Karen annex Thomas's land just to funnel construction contracts to Ridgepoint? Frank looked cornered. Then, he cracked out. Frank, I didn't know how she filed the zoning change. She told me it was approved. She said everything was above board. Thomas stood in the back of the room. Thomas, you poured concrete over a family's history for a bonus check. Frank, she said the lakefront was going to be common space, that it was neglected. Meyer, she falsified boundaries, faked permits, routed public HOA funds to her brother's private firm. That's criminal conspiracy. The room was silent. Then someone clapped. Then another. And then the vote was called. Karen Holland was officially removed as HOA president in a unanimous vote. By then, she had lawyered up. But it was too late. The county building department, the state HOA regulatory board, and even the district attorney's office had opened concurrent investigations. The final blow came when the former construction foreman publicly admitted on record, we were told to skip soil testing to keep the budget under HOA cap. Karen said she'd handle the paperwork. For Thomas, the twist was bitter. The battle he'd fought, the trespass, the fines, the defamation wasn't just over land. It was over fraud, over greed disguised as governance. And when he returned to his cabin that evening, he didn't feel victorious. He felt tired. He walked down to the waterline, where the storm had left tree limbs and debris scattered across the shore. There, half submerged, was the first condo's retaining wall, cracked through and sagging into the lake like a broken promise. The sun was setting behind the hills. And for the first time in months, the lake was still. But the story wasn't over, because the damage Karen caused wasn't just structural, it was personal, financial, emotional. People lost faith in the HOA. Neighbors questioned everything. And Thomas, he had one last move to make. Because when someone builds on stolen ground, They never expect the real owner to fight back in court. And that's exactly where he was headed next. It took 7 months. 7 months of hearings, subpoenas, depositions. 7 months of watching neighbors tear up their yards to check for mold. 7 months of waiting for justice to catch up with the flood. But justice finally came. The courtroom wasn't fleshy, just a long rectangular chamber in the county courthouse, with peeling paint and worn pew-style benches. Thomas sat in the plaintiff's section. Meyer beside him, hands clasped, eyes steady. On the other side, Karen Holland. Her hair was darker now, her expression brittle. Next to her sat her attorney, whispering and scribbling notes. The case was simple in legal terms, but devastating in consequence. Illegal annexation, unauthorized development, property damage, fraud. The county laid it out plainly. Karen, in her position as HOA president, had used forged filings to bring Thomas's private exempt parcel under HOA control. She then approved construction plans without permits, funneled contracts to her brother's company, and ignored environmental laws to push forward a doomed development. And the result? 3 condemned homes. Over $3 million in combined damages. As shoreline permanently scarred, Karen's defense tried to spin it. They argued she had acted in the community's best interest, that the annexation was believed to be valid, and that no personal financial gain was ever proven. But when Maya stood, she didn't raise her voice. She just played the video, the one of Karen, back in part 2, standing on Thomas's land and saying to the camera, "Karen, we're excited to bring your section into our growing community." And then Maya placed the original 1971 exemption letter on the evidence table, signed, sealed, and never revoked. Meyer, this was never HOA land. She knew that. She just thought no one would stop her. The judge's ruling came fast. Annexation voided. HOA fined $150,000 in civil penalties. Karen personally liable for damages. Thomas's land declared wholly independent once and for all. And in a final blow, Ridgepoint Development's Karen's brother's firm was banned from county contracts indefinitely. Outside the courthouse, Thomas didn't celebrate. He just stood in the sun, breathing deep, watching as cameras tried to swarm Karen on the steps. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She just walked quickly to her car alone. Thomas used part of the settlement to repair his shoreline. He didn't pave it. He planted native grasses, rebuilt the old dock with reclaimed cedar, and placed a hand-carved sign at the slope. Protected, permanently, the condos were demolished. Were rebuilt after passing real inspections. The rest of the land zoned back to green space. The new HOA board agreed unanimously. Thomas never rejoined. He never had to. Months later, at a community BBQ, a couple approached him. It was the same couple who had once whispered, afraid to speak up. "Woman, we're sorry we didn't say something sooner. You were right." Thomas gave a quiet nod. "Thomas, it's okay. It took me too long to speak up, too." The lake eventually receded, but the lesson stayed. Power isn't in the rules. It's in how people enforce them. And sometimes, the quietest voice in the room is the one holding the deed. Karen tried to own what wasn't hers. She tried to rewrite boundaries with ink and concrete. But the land remembered, the lake resisted. And Thomas, he stood his ground. In the end, karma didn't need to knock on her door. It flooded it.